We always like to start with just some facts about the sector as a whole. And like I said, sometimes it's useful for us to recognize just how important an element the nonprofit sector is in terms of the total economy. So we account for 9% of the wages, 5.4% of GDP. The number of tax-exempt organizations, 1.5, almost 1.6 million. Of that, about almost a million are public charities, 501c3s, which is what I think most of us are familiar with, most of what you fund. And of that almost 1 million, this estimate says about 100,000 are private foundations. I frankly think that's a little inflated. All the other data that I see is closer to 75 to 80,000 private foundations. So I'm not quite sure where they pulled that number. But then there's another, almost a little more than 500,000 other types of tax-exempt organizations. And they range, it's just incredible the broad range of nonprofit tax-exempt organizations that most of you, like cemeteries. I mean, I didn't know that they actually constituted a tax-exempt category. There are things, I have a whole list, and actually I thought if anyone's interested, we could pass this around. If you're not familiar with the tax-exempt organizations, things like the Chambers of Commerce that you're probably more familiar with, but Teachers Retirement Fund associations, and it's just an amazing assortment of different tax-exempt organizations. So we're part of a very large sector, and the general public has very little understanding, I think, of just the variety. And then we've got about 278,000, a little more than that, of congregations, which generally are, they're all 501c3s, although most of them don't necessarily file for their separate status. So, and I think a lot of the funders here in the room won't fund a congregation or a religious institution unless it has its official 501c3 declaration from the IRS. Okay, and this is hot off the presses. You probably were watching, paying attention this week that Giving USA has put out their latest information regarding charitable contributions. $298 billion is what they're estimating was generated in 2011. And as is always the case, 73% about from individuals, another 8% bequests. So individuals represent over 80% of total charitable contributions. Corporations 5%, foundations about 14%. This is good news compared to last year because the estimate last year was 290 billion, so this is slightly up. The bad news is that they always revise their numbers as they get more data in. In the last 2 years, the numbers have been revised downward. So there's a chance that we may be flat in terms of 2011 relative. And then you compare to 2008, $307 billion. So we've been on a decline as a result of the economy. So we've got a long way to go, and some of the estimates are as it may take another 10 years before we recover in terms of charitable donations from where we were at our high point. So this is the sort of sad news for us in the sector at the moment. It's not going to be a quick recovery given the amount of charitable contributions that we've lost over as a result of the economic downturn. Again, you've all seen these pie charts, I'm sure, where the contributions go. As always, religion is the biggest category. It's 32% of all the charitable dollars go to religion. Education, human services, and health make up the bulk of it, and then it's really a mix. What I'm understanding is the one area that's a growth area in the last year is international giving. That's actually up. But for the most part, all the sectors have suffered. So individual giving, again, let's take a look at in the United States. The good news is, according to the latest study, 3.9% up in 2011. Was there a hand raised?
No.
Okay. And on average, I don't think this comes from the Giving USA study, but this is data that I've collected over time. 65% of U.S. households with incomes less than 100K donated to charity the last time this particular survey was done. And nearly 98% of wealthy households with incomes above 200,000 donated. So we are an extremely charitable country relative to certainly some of the European countries. The most wealthy 30% of households contribute 75% of all the individual charitable contributions. You probably all know United Way, everybody's out there trying to get the dollars from the most wealthy. 60% of individual contributions go to support religious organizations. You saw on the last chart it was like almost 40%, but that's because foundations in general don't, and corporations don't contribute to religious organizations, but individuals. The minority of wealthy donors, this is one survey that suggested they would be willing to donate as much as $20 billion more than they currently give if they were asked properly. I thought that was very interesting, that they have capacity and it's all in how they're approached. Why people give, I'm sure you've all seen this data, so I'm just going to quickly just identify, asked by someone you know. No-brainer. Volunteered in an organization, you're much more likely to contribute. Reading or hearing about it in a news story. That's why there's so much effort to get PR out there. And it goes on down. This is a somewhat old survey data because it doesn't include email, social media kinds of things. But so I think we'll see that increasing as a reason for giving. This is the pitch I make when I'm talking to nonprofits always is, particularly in Arizona, it's the same everywhere, but in Arizona, the individual giving represents the greatest potential. We rank 26th in charitable giving as a percentage of adjusted gross income, so that's not bad. We're in the middle of the pack. And individuals who itemized, which is about 37% of all Arizonans, contributed in 2008 $2.9 billion. Unfortunately, that was a 14% decrease over 2006, but that's, we're going to, in a little while, we'll talk about what the foundation piece of all charitable giving is, but that's enormous, $2.9 billion. We, in 2008, ranked 18th in number of tax returns reporting incomes above $200,000, but 34th in terms of average contribution for those same folks. And that was a significant decline. I've been tracking individual giving. This is based on their tax filings. These are people who file in Arizona, so they're not giving elsewhere, they're just not giving. And 2005 was the only year when the giving of folks at this income level matched the rank in the state. And then the next year it declined. They gave about $5,000 more per household for 1 year. And I have my theories about that, but to me what that represents is potential. They're capable of giving, it's just how do you reach them? But if Arizona taxpayers who itemize contributed at the rate of the 10 most generous states, charitable contributions in Arizona would increase by $2.35 billion. And even if we gave at the national average, it would increase by $580 million. So we're below average even in terms of our average charitable contribution. So again, that represents potential. As I stress with the nonprofits, they're out there. The question is, how do you reach them to generate additional revenues? And this is based on the ASU Lodestar Center 2010 giving volunteering information. How did the donations get distributed? This is based on a household survey. Not surprising, religion. It's a little lower than the national averages, but still well above 40%. Basic needs, youth and family, you can see it. And international is the low end. Volunteering, 26% of Americans over age 16 volunteered in 2010. The average worth of a volunteer is $29.79 per hour. In Arizona, because our basically wage structure is lower than the national average, it's valued at $19.71. And what I'm understanding, this is thanks to Emma, who's been following a lot of the social media stuff, there are tools out there to try and increase particularly volunteering among the young people, and these are just some of the examples. And don't ask me to describe what they are, because I don't know. But they sound cool. What's the value of volunteering? This is a number I had not seen calculated before, so I was quite surprised when we did the numbers here. But again, the ASU Giving and Volunteering Study estimated that 33% of Arizonans volunteer out of 6.5 million people in 2008. That was, and they gave an average of 4 hours a week, is what they reported anyway. That was 450 million hours per year, which translated at our state value $8.66 billion in contributed effort to the nonprofit sector in Arizona. That's huge. You think about what would happen if folks weren't volunteering, and think about what we could do if we could increase the percentage, if only a third of folks volunteer. And AGF is spending a lot of time trying to promote the benefits of older adults and what they represent to nonprofits in terms of volunteer capacity. So there's potential out there to improve the sector. Here's a chart on institutional giving in the United States. The chart's a little bit dated, so I will qualify that. This was a chart generated when things were booming in the United States in terms of the number of foundations. They certainly have been increasing steadily. The pace has recently slowed, not surprisingly, and so I don't think we're going to reach the 110,000 by 2015 that was projected at this idealistic time. But the truth is, 80% of foundations have been formed just since 1980. So, we are a new sector, truly, in terms of the size of the sector. Foundation giving declined by 9% in 2009. It held steady in 2010, and in 2011 it was up slightly. So that's the good news. I think the worst, in terms of the loss of foundation assets is behind us, hopefully, so that giving is starting to even out. Here's a comparison of giving vehicles. Again, if we're part of the sector, I think it's important for us to know the variety of options that are out there, at least be conversant about them. Donor advised funds, I'm sure everybody here knows what they are. I don't think I knew how many there were, 152,000 and growing. And the assets right now are relatively small compared to foundations, 25 billion in donor advised funds compared to private foundations, which had 583 billion. And certainly, but the number of private foundations, 75,000 compared to 152. In the next slide, we'll talk about the growth of the donor advised funds. And don't ask me to explain what any of these other items are. I think you almost need an attorney. The charitable remainder unit trusts, the charitable remainder annuity trusts, the charitable lead trusts, and pooled income funds. Lois, you probably know what all these are, but the point is that there's a variety of vehicles that are out there to encourage people to contribute. Private foundations, clearly in terms of assets, are still the largest, but donor advised funds are coming along strong. And a little bit more, donor advised funds, charitable giving vehicle administered by a public charity, created the purpose of managing charitable donations on behalf of an organization, family, or individual. The trend is that more and more small private foundations are converting to donor advised funds. There was an increase in 2009 of 12.7%. What I was reading in an article just yesterday was the growth between 2010 and 11 was 77% in donor advised funds. I know. It's sort of like I can't verify that data, but what I can say is they're growing rapidly. The commercial funds are one place that's really growing extremely rapidly. Fidelity, 3.6 billion, Schwab, 1.7, and Vanguard close behind at 1.6. Obviously, community foundations host the donor advised funds, as do churches and universities. The benefit of the donor advised funds is, first of all, you don't have to worry about the administrative aspect of a private foundation because it's handled by the institution that manages your donor advised fund. You also don't have to abide by the giving floor, the 5%. It's always suggested, but you're not required to give a certain amount every year. Most importantly, they're not accessible to the general public. People don't know who's giving what within those donor advised funds. So it's a way for donors to maintain privacy and basically a firewall between themselves and the nonprofits. So this is a bit of a concern if the number of foundations goes down and more money goes into donor advised funds that are no longer accessible to nonprofits in the standard way. So it's an interesting I think, dilemma for the sector to think about. A little bit about giving in Arizona from the institutional standpoint. Good news is, we grew significantly from 2 billion in assets to almost 6 billion in 2008. And 2008 was measuring a pretty steep decline in foundation assets because that was when the stock market went down, I think 27%. So my guess is we're well above the $6 billion mark now. Last count, which was 2008, we had 1,310 grant makers in the state. As I tell all the nonprofits, we have 2% of the U.S. population. We truly have about 0.7% of the foundation assets, and we're ranked 40th in terms of private assets per capita. So we are an under-resourced state. We are facing some of the most severe problems. We're 48th to 45th in almost all the social issues that we're struggling with, but we don't have the institutional assets to deal with them. It's primarily because we're a young state. We're 100 years old, so we don't have the generation upon generation of family wealth that continues to be invested in this state.
Chris, inside the
Yeah.
1310 grant makers, are those included individual donor advised funds or just
No.
Separate entities?
Separate entities that file some kind of tax document.
Okay.
Yeah. So in our data, Community Foundation is in there, and all those donor advised
Right.
funds are part of their filing. Okay, so 2008, private foundations, public grant making charities, the United Ways, and major corporations made grants about $653 million. Remember the slide way back when it was $2.8 billion from individuals? This is how much the foundation community contributes to the charitable pool. Out-of-state foundations, our estimate is about another 100 million. The top 40 largest private and public foundations in Arizona represent 72% of total foundation assets. So all these nonprofits going after foundation dollars, I mean, this is also pretty much all the foundations that have staff. Somewhere between 40 and 45 have either one or more staff or a paid trustee. Very, very small institutional sector. Between January 2010 and February 2012, 44 new foundations registered. Total assets, $22.3 million. And only 7 had assets greater than $1 million. So these are what I see as placeholders. They're hopefully foundations that will be endowed at some point when somebody passes on and their estate gets deposited, and or now they're a vehicle for charitable donations. So the past money gets put in and then spent out. But it's not a tsunami. A search of grants made by someone I think that you folks had asked me about how many actually support general operating expenses. So I did a search on Foundation Center, and so I searched first using the search criteria general operating. So if the foundation listed that in their description of the grant, so the Foundation Center could incorporate it into their database. I found 618 grants that were targeted as for general operating purposes by only 24 foundations. And that was between 2008 and 2012. Foundations can also say what they support in their general description, the kinds of areas that they support. And based on that search of foundations in Arizona, a total of 228 out of 1,310 identified general operating support as something they do provide. But when I look at the grants, there are only 40 that actually identify grants as providing general operating support. So it's still a pretty small universe. I think this is interesting data translated for you. Again, this is 2000-2010, a summary of all grants made from all foundations to Arizona nonprofits. So about 2.4 trillion. Am I right in that? Billion, okay, 2.4 billion. All right, well, that was wishful thinking. So that's all foundations to Arizona nonprofits. And you look at grants from Arizona foundations to all nonprofits all over the country, about the same amount. So the money coming in almost matches the money going out. But then you look at grants from Arizona foundations to Arizona nonprofits, and only about half. So the good news is that's over a 10-year period. When we've been looking more recently, our 2008 study said about 70% of the grants made by Arizona foundations stayed in Arizona. So the trend is getting better. The overall average is only 50%. But as we've had larger foundations move in here, Piper being focused on Maricopa County, you see a lot of those big grants now staying in Arizona. But we still lose a lot of money out of state. I mean, I look at all these foundations that, they could be a member of AGF, and then I go look at their grants, and it's like they don't make one grant in Arizona. So they're probably not gonna join AGF, Molly, despite your...
Making the calls.
I know, Molly makes these calls. We have a new one for you, by the
Oh,
way.
good.
Yes,
Excellent.
yes. I know. We get excited about one new foundation.
I sent her an email.
Oh, you did?
Oh,
Okay.
you did?
Yeah.
Check your email, Molly. They give $2 million a year. We were excited.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, I know. So where do the foundation dollars go? The challenge with this database, we use something called Foundation Search, which is a national for-profit entity. Problem was that I think they got lazy, or they just didn't know. When you look at the grants and you're doing a national database, they don't necessarily know what kind of organization it is based by the name of it, and they're not spending the time to go online and look up and say, oh, that's actually an animal shelter. It could be Maggie's Place. Well, they don't know if it's an animal shelter or whatever, so they stick it in miscellaneous.
Oh.
So that's why miscellaneous is so high. But anyway, education, not surprisingly, is a biggie. Social and human services, and then it goes on down from there. And this is what I share with the nonprofits. The competition is incredibly stiff. Lodestar Center says there were at least 15,000 501c3s in Arizona. 70% of them have incomes less than 100,000. So the majority of these are very small. And we're happy to make this PowerPoint available to all of you, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes. We can send it out to everyone afterwards. I should have said that in the beginning. Your hands are all exhausted now. But so take a look. I mean, 15,000, Nancy, you were right on. It's about 1,310 grant-making entities, and only 385 of which have assets over $1 million. So, you know, when you guys wonder why you're getting hammered and want to stay below the radar, it's because you've got a whole lot of people looking for money from a very small pool of foundations that even have staff to manage the applications that come in. So a little bit about the nonprofits. We had invited Patrick to come and do this piece of it, but he's in Washington, D.C. I think it was up on the Hill, sort of lobbying our legislators regarding the nonprofits. But anyway, here's, in terms of total nonprofits in Arizona, 21,000. And that's, remember we talked about all the tax exempt organizations. 68.4 are the 501c3s. Private foundations represent 7.4%, and the other nonprofits about 24.2%. This is based on the recent survey that the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits did of their members in terms of how are they doing. This was, they generated at the very beginning of the year. So their revenues are still dropping, but not as severely. I mean, I guess that's the good news. You can see from the color code. Significant portion lost revenues, just not as bad as it was last year. In terms of the responses to the survey, 84% expected demand to rise in 2012. 68% said they served more people in 2011, and 45% are reducing their budgets in 2012. So that's kind of what we're looking at. All of you who have resources, this is the state of the sector. And the mix of where these nonprofits get their money, obviously private foundations, the corporate giving programs, community and public foundations, individuals, and government. And this is a good graphic that I like that indicates where the money comes from. So you can see 32.3% on average of a nonprofit's revenue stream comes from government, either government grants or government contracts. 7% investments, 12.5% private contributions, private fees for services, almost 50%. And obviously this is the sector as a whole, so you've got museums and theater and hospitals that charge fees, so certain parts of the sector have, an earned revenue stream that's possible, and there are others that don't. So, but this is a look at the industry as a whole. We've talked about doing this video. I'm not quite sure it's the best time to do this video. This was basically, it's an interview with one of the top 5 funders who won Outstanding Funder Award. I'm trying to think who was the organization. It wasn't GEO. Do you remember which?
Center for Effective
Okay, Center for Effective Philanthropy. So it's about a 5.5-minute interview. He's basically talking about who he is as a grantor and how he interacts with nonprofits and what may have led to him being nominated as one of the top 5. But is there a desire to see this video?
Move on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's more important that we as a group here talk about the data that got presented in terms of what its relevance is. We could do a whole nother program on what does it mean to be an effective grant maker and to know what those qualities are. He happened to have been working for a nonprofit before he moved into his foundation position, which I think increased his empathy for the folks that were applying for money from him. Okay, resources that you just need to know about. Nationally, GrantCraft, GEO, Just Grants Arizona, which is now managed by the Alliance for Arizona Nonprofits. You guys know all of this. AGF, don't forget us. Alliance for Arizona Nonprofits, Lodestar Center, AZ Gates, and the Arizona Community Foundation. So again, this is what I share with the nonprofits when they're wanting to know more about their sector. Okay, what we would like to do at this point